Okay, let's see if this is actually working. Yeah, looks like it is. Awesome. Cool. Well, let's get down to it. So let's see. So the feature that I'm trying to work on here is allowing custom inspectors to work for clicking on a component. So see, for example, we start up codelift, and as usual, you can go through and like select something and I don't know, start working on like background colors or whatever and get a preview. But what I want to be able to do is make it to where if I have a component, I'm going to double click and actually open this thing up. I think I still have that enabled. Yep. So, double click, it takes me to this definition or the implementation where it lives. But what I wanted to be able to do is make it such that this header, clicking into it, would be able to give me a custom inspector. So as you can see here, I have a custom inspector that's not actually created by codelift, but is provided by my custom app. That's what's running in the background, this Next.js application here. And need to make that thing do a reselect, so that way we don't lose whenever we toggle codelift on and off. But you can see that I have a title and some text here, and the header accepts the title as a prop and it renders it right after a greeting. So I have like some greetings. If you click this text, it'll take you to /hello, and that has a prefix. So then if I were to inspect this, I should be able to say hello live stream. So this comes from this little snippet of code here, which actually isn't too much. So by defining header.inspector, or the inspector property on any component, really, codelift will automatically pop that into this right panel. And given props, it's whatever like the latest props are. So as I change this, my inspector is listening and getting re-rendered and re-rendering this input. And then whenever I call set props, by changing this input, normal React stuff here, by calling set props, it tells codelift to go ahead and re-render this preview in place, and we have a live stream going. So I can say hello world, and if you look up here, we have a reset option that codelift gives us that's going to reset the props back to normal, or we can say live stream again, hello live stream. And if we say save changes, let's watch this file for a second and see what happens. What should occur is, oh, you know what? That's right. Let me go back to where this thing's used. So let me double click. And the title has changed, hello live stream. So that's pretty cool. And if I were to discard these changes, it went back to normal, and my page refreshes because that's what Next.js is going to do. So cool. That's exactly what I wanted. But the problem is with this is there's going to be some errors in the console because whenever I see this inspector on the header component, ideally you really want the re-render of this component to happen whenever like the props change. And so like, the props will re-render the children. What I'm having to do is whenever set props is called, I have this component inspector that's part of codelift. Let's get some breathing room in here. This component inspector, if I were to look for set props, I call this preview props function that exists on our model React node. And oh, whoops, this is a cold start for VS Code, so it doesn't know my structure yet. We'll just fast forward to it. Yeah, we set props, and oh, of course, everything's using effect now. So whenever props change, we have an effect that's going to use a React DOM from your own app, using React from your own app, so that way we have access to all the same hooks and same properties and same context, which is crucial for things like a router. And we basically create the inspector, we render it on the side panel. That's how this gets rendered over here, as if it was part of your app, but it's actually within codelift's own iframe. And then whenever we render the preview over this text, we're actually replacing, not even actually replacing, we're rendering the preview within that same node that you have. So React DOM doesn't actually have a great way of saying, render to this element and replace it with a live React tree. It can only render within your div, your root div. So that's a bit of a problem here, because I'm basically just calling React render all over your DOM nodes and mutating it. So anyway, the ideal is that somehow this header component basically has a higher order function around it that I can tell it to re-render just this one with these brand new props, and by default just kind of passing through. So this might be a little bit tricky. So my attack strategy is going to be, I like to take some notes in here. So we're gonna try this. Convert, header.inspector to export const header equals editable, normal props, right? So this is the signature I kind of want. I want to pass off edit. I kind of don't like higher order components anymore, but for now this is what we have to live with. And then let's see, we need to have codelift should export an editable function, and then question, how should codelift know to re-render this header when things change, and then how will codelift sync props changes between the two. So this is where things get a little bit tricky. So within codelift, we kind of have two instances that are real important. So there's an iframe, which is your app. Your app's running on 3000 like usual. On the outside, codelift is running on a very elite port of 1337. So what makes this a little bit tricky is that the way I'm accessing prompts is whenever I go and inspect these elements, I'm trying to think what was the best way I can see this. When I inspect these elements, I'm accessing your window object. I'm looking on the element itself, and I'm looking at the React internal instance that gets added by Fiber. At least I think it's Fiber. And I could get stuff like debug source, and I can start looking into these other things like memo-wise props. And this gives me a little bit more information towards how React rendered this. And memo-wise props, as I understand it, is the last rendered props onto this element. So if I were to look at this href, this anchor tag, I should see about the same thing. See child, memo-wise props, children, and we have this children with an object with basically another React tag inside of it, and then there's Next.js. And so there's a way I can go in here and actually look at the specifics of what the props really were, and I have that logic elsewhere. So first thing we can do is we can just break this, and break it by changing our signature for our header. So instead of this inspector being exported this way, let's do this. I'm going to call it const inspector equals whatever this was. There we go. So that's our inspector component. Instead of header.inspector, I'm going to do, let's say, editable. And let's do editable. And we're going to wrap this So the first thing is going to be the editable component followed by the inspector that we're going to use to edit it. So ideally, like whenever this is, shipped to production, two things, the editable export, that's funny, I already have like a placeholder for it, is going to be a no op. And then the second thing is that we'll probably investigate something like using, like React.lazy for like wrapping like an actual inspector file. So that way you have like header.inspector.tsx or something. So that way it gets code split and you don't actually bundle your inspector outside of like development mode. But for right now, let's just try to get the architecture in place. Then we can go from there. So yeah, export const header with, what this header is going to be. And actually, you know what? Let's do this because I just don't like a lot of, deeply nested children and objects and all that. So we're going to do this. We're going to export header. It's going to be an editable. I wonder if you could do this. Actually, does that not work? Can you not do object definitions? That's interesting. I've never actually done a reassignment like this. So, because I know you can do export header and that works fine. Export header reassign or something. Oh, header, dummy. ES6 exports reassign. I don't know if I want to go down this rabbit hole. I was really just hoping, so this is interesting. I could do a reassignment like this. Maybe that's a problem. But header's already defined. Yeah. Can't redeclare that. Come on. Don't need as. That's part of like the import something as. Yeah, that's kind of a shame. I have an export stuff as export import as something. So, probably no. Okay, see that, man, it's such a shame because in the effort to make it cleaner, actually makes it so much uglier. That's why I just don't like the higher order components. Like a way around this would be having like a Babel plugin, but the whole point was I was just trying to make this so that way you can run it within your own app using your build process with your with things that makes your code unique. So that way I didn't have to like mandate any sort of workflow or ejecting from Create React App, for instance. So let's just live with the noise. We can clean up noise later, right? That's a premature optimization. So let's save this. This thing's going to fail because we can't import something that doesn't actually exist. So let's go. I said I was going to be breaking it, so here we are, we're breaking it. So let's make sure that we actually export this. We have a register function, which is what is doing the initial cross-domain access. So let's do editable, and I already have like a helper here that says just inline require this thing. Otherwise, let's do another no op here. I always read this as noop, but all right. So let's save this, and let's add a new file somehow, and this is going to be editable.js because this is outside of the TypeScript rendering of Next.js. That's actually kind of interesting about like codelift is that it's pretty much just a Next.js app. So like the vast majority of the time I get to leverage TypeScript except for the direct require statements because I don't want to bother with a rollup or Webpack or micro bundle or anything right now. So anyway, so let's do this. Well, can't do an export. I think we have to do like a module dot exports. It's funny, like I don't remember ES5 syntax anymore. Okay, so we're gonna export the full object. So let's do our higher order function, which is gonna be an editable. Let's see, we're gonna receive a component, and we're gonna receive an inspector, and this is where it's supposed to return, you know, a more, you know, functional component to where it's like, let's return editable component. And this thing, I kind of don't know what the signature is going to be yet. Let's just start with props for now. And we're going to return, you know, component. Yeah, so we're going to return the component for this with the prop spread across it. So basically, whenever we render an editable header, it should just keep rendering the header as usual. And what we can do is take away this return, and let's return the component. And let's do some of that same assignment that I was already doing. So where I said like editable component dot inspector equals inspector. So this is largely what I already had, but now I'm just going through a higher order component. So I just changed the definition from, well, let's get it working first. And then, oh, that's right. So I'm trying to think. I mean, what I could do, I could take away editable component and just call it component. And we'll get into the actual higher order aspect of like creating things in a little bit. Object is not a function. Let's see what we have. That is not a function. Module exports equals. So let's trace some things back real quick. Let's just make sure. Editable equals slash editable. And the header is going to be this. So let's do this. Export. So we probably won't even make it to this part. Oh, yeah, we probably won't even make it to this part because there's a runtime error happening. Yeah, where that thing's not a function. So that means editable isn't actually doing what I think it is. So let's do console.log editable, and let's make sure it's actually defined. Editable. Compiling. Editable is undefined. That's what I was afraid of. So we have our index here. It says in development requires slash editable. Editable. And then here's our actual. Yeah, we need to figure out why this is happening. Because I have a register function that looks pretty much exactly the same. The only thing I could think of is module exports. Yeah, one thing I could think of is something's just a little wacky with this render or with this compilation. We can go from there. All right. So whenever I run yarn next, this is just a development alias to go into my next example and run codelift dev. Codelift is all it does whenever you say codelift whatever, codelift start, codelift dev. All it does is run yarn start, yarn dev, as well as just running the codelift server. So it's just a pass through for yarn by default right now. And it's doing all the normal stuff like, yeah, waiting for the server to start before it actually kicks itself off, because if your own app is broken, then there's no point in starting codelift, at least right now. Module exports. Oh, you know what? No, that should be fine. I should be able to do module exports editable and do like per name. One thing that we can do is we can do this. We can do star as codelift, and we can actually see what gets exported, just to make sure that it's actually valid syntax, so it should be fine. Let's try this. I could tell eCam's chewing through my CPU. Anyway. So this way we can actually see what's being exported by the codelift library package. And we'll pull the editable export off of it, see what that value is. And then we'll be able to go from here. So I'm thinking, while this builds, and I just realized that my computer's not plugged into a charger, that would help. There we go. All right, cool. Now we're getting some pretty beast errors in here, but index.tsx, we're getting some good errors. Index.tsx, let's see what this is. Yeah, we have API, and then we have the actual pages themselves. Trying to import header. So yeah, we have this whole tree that's running into issues now. So let's do this. Let's go back to what we had. Let's get yarn next going. Because we should be calling it as a function. Because the alternative for writing this would be like module.exports equals, you know, the object, which is totally fine too. I just thought we could have done the named exports and gone away with it. But I don't know, it's been a while. Maybe things are different than what I remember. Yeah, so one thing that I want to do, because I just don't have the patience for starting up servers and waiting. But one of the things I kind of like is that optimistic scenario with like user experiences. Instead of waiting on localhost to start up, is I want to, codelift is already compiled. I mean, development, it's not. So there's a delay waiting in development for like codelift to also start and compile. So we have like two next instances running, you know, one for like the local app I'm simulating and then one for codelift. But then whenever I ship codelift, I compile it down with Next.js. I do the next build command and it gets compiled down. And so it starts up super fast, like any other Next.js server. So what I at least like to do for like local development for myself, but also for users using codelift is yeah, now you can see that codelift is compiling, is go ahead and just pop open the browser and show you know, the user what's going on, and use the state machine to say like, okay, well, yeah, first we got to start the server and we're waiting on it. And now that we're waiting on it, we're validating that we can actually access it. And then once we've accessed it, now we can load it and that sort of thing. So, all right, so here's the issue that we're running into. So editable is considered a no-op right now. So we don't actually want a no-op in this case. And we have like basically like an infinite loop. So what I'm going to do is because we don't actually want to do like nothing. We can at least return, you know, the first argument. We probably don't care about all the args, but we can at least like return the first argument. What's also interesting is that this shouldn't be returning a no-op right now, right? Because we're in development mode. But I see. So part of the problem here is the window check. This is happening on the server. That's what it is. Because we're on the server, this thing's trying to do like a no-op right now. Yep, that's exactly what the issue is. So we're not, yeah. in the window, we return like an editable object. On the server, we're just going to render it as is, so it just needs to pass it through. So my no op should be something like, if it's development, we're going to require, editable. Otherwise, pretty much what I have is that arg should return arg. So this could just be like an old reference. So let's run this one more time. The value of console log. So the thing to think of is that this editable is going to be part of part of your app. So I will be able to see this whenever I inspect a component, but I need to be able to kind of tell this editable instance to to basically like set props or something. So I had to expose a way of like setting the props to force this into re-render. That's really what I need to be able to do. Is I need to tell this specific editable instance to re-render. So I won't save it outright just yet, but something along the lines of we want to be able to have something where like I return a editable component. This thing is going to receive some sort of props or something, and this is really just going to be a dumb pass through for whatever props are already coming into it. So it's just going to pass it through by default, and things won't look any different. Perhaps like in a React render tree, we'll see that there's like a wrapping component, which is the annoying thing with higher order components, but for now that's kind of what we have. Then the trick that we kind of need is something to like listen right here. Listen for new prompts or something, because there's going to be a separate inspector rendered on the page, and it needs to be able to point to something to trigger like a refresh. So one thing I know that I've done before is you could use a key to basically force like a re-render. So like a key version or something usually helps to force like a re-render. So if like these props actually change, I could swap out what the key is, and hang on a second, let me see if, nope. Okay, cool. Anyway, you can swap out like the key to force this thing to re-render. Or if the props change, that's kind of like ideal too. So the trick is like, how can I change what this reference is to props? Well, like one way is we can use state, so we could do something like a const, I kind of hate to reassign it, but like latest props or something. So latest props equals use state, and we'll start off like with the existing props, and then we could say render whatever like the latest props are. So the trick is like, how to set latest props to inspector. Because remember, the inspector signature is, it looks like this: const inspector equals, whatever the props are that we're inspecting, and then set props. So then that way, like on change events, like on change events, what we're able to do is set what the props are, and then we want our original component to pretty much just render, but like with whatever the latest stuff is, and then a way to reset it whenever we're done editing. So then the tricky thing is, how are we going to get this hook for the inspector? How are we going to give them both like kind of access when they're in two different parts of like a render tree? So just talking it out, whenever I hear like two different parts of the render tree, the thing that I always kind of think of is like context, and that might be like the solution here. So once we can get this stuff compiling, should check this a little bit sooner, but I think I'm running more into a runtime issue here more than anything, where some reason like whatever's being provided is not accessible for me. That's such a shame. Well, in situations like this, what I'll end up doing is let's get back into a faster scenario where things are working. So I have like the code I kind of care about, the export. That's actually, the fact that I had that saved is not good. Anyway, we'll get things into like a situation where I can console log it instead of me directly assigning it and working on header. I'm going to be a little bit more diligent to see what do I actually have out of the box and make sure I have access to it before I start working on it. So this is like a little bit rare because it's not too often that I'm adding an export to like codelift, and most of the issues I might run into are going to be like client-side issues. So there's usually a very fast refresh rate, feedback loop in that situation, because I haven't had to worry about like starting servers again, much less starting two servers. And on the client, we're looking at like maybe a second, two tops, if there's like a really big dependency tree that I have to change. So what we'll do, we'll get the app back up and running. I've done my research. I know how to actually solve the problem. And then in a way that I can really focus on the client-side implementation. So the client-side implementation, what I'm thinking is, as this editable component, I need to do two things. One, I need to get access to the to the React or React DOM that we have. But let's say we have access to React. What I should be able to do is, I think it's React create context, and I can create a context object this way. So we'll create context, and let's say there's some like initial value of null or something. I don't know what TypeScript's going to bark at or not, but we'll have context, and then I should be able to, app is starting. What I should be able to do is have a use context hook of whatever, I don't know how many places I'm using context anymore, but I should be able to use context to actually get like, the value of, the value of like what we have here. And I know I actually saw Kinsey Dodds had an article about this as well, but we should be able to have a couple things for like retrieving the value and like setting the value on it. And then that way the inspector could do pretty much the same thing. We can wrap the inspector, or at least like the props that get passed to the inspector is basically like a, props or set props. So this is, rather than state, I use it like this since they're two different parts of the dependency tree, and I can fetch them from here. So the only thing is that this editable component, the initial context props are going to come from here. So that's kind of see how this like works out, because we need a re-render due to the use of context. So there has to be like a use in there. But again, let's get back to just getting the hook in place, the higher order component, and then we'll go from there. So let's try to import editable, make sure that works. It's funny, everything's going about like quarter speed with the stream running. All right. And let's see what we get back on both ends. So both from the server standpoint, what is the value of editable? And I wonder if I need a refresh. Yeah, it's a no op. Okay. Now let's do editable. Yeah, so that gets, just kind of want to make sure that I actually get like that function back. So we do know that we have editable. It's a no op. Otherwise, it's the client side, client facing editable function. I'm going to export this header and call this editable. And I'm not going to assign a component yet. Let's just make sure that this can actually run. So it's a wrapper. Ah, look at that. I lost the name of this thing. So that's pretty interesting already. Even though I'm returning component, the fact that it's being wrapped means I lost the name. God, see, this is why I don't miss higher order components. Yep. Yeah, we lost it. And I'm returning the component as is too. So it's almost like, yeah, it's interesting. It's returning the component as is, but somehow the name got lost. I think that's actually pretty fascinating. It makes me want to like just kind of nuke this approach because yeah, that's exactly it. Is that like I don't like the idea of having to change the structure of what you're returning. It's one thing to add like a property like inspector or get initial prompts. It's another thing whenever you start having your document polluted by extraneous elements, and now you can't really rely on the structure or the number, which children are even like returning anymore. God knows how it's actually going to work with like fragments. So let's take a look at this BG black text white part, because that is my header instance. And I'm going to look to see, debug source. See, it's kind of like the same thing. Children, we have like a type here. And there's like lots of neat little properties that we can look at to where we see like, what kind of gets returned. We have hooks like use context in here. And then there's some things that you can look at to see, yeah, here's this type. And usually that type is supposed to have a name. So this type does not have a name because I guess it's not being inferred from like the dependency tree. Yeah, export const header equals editable, whatever. So if this thing said function header, let's see what that does. Oh, sorry, whoops. Function can't have arrows. Yuck. I don't like how this is looking though. All right, so I got it back. Great. Yeah, who wants to litter their code with all this stuff, right? I would see this and be like, oh, no, this codelift thing, this is taking the wrong approach whenever I had to make it look this messy. So then let's take our inspector, and I'm going to call it function inspector just for the heck of it. Might as well. And then we'll let prettier do his thing. I'm just going to super indent it all. And we should still be able to have like an editable inspector. Yep. Cool. Yep, that's what I expected. So that's the signature that I would expect for header, which is some line link stuff. But anyway, editable function header followed by whatever the actual inspector is. Great. We corrected our no op to, I don't know why it's putting new line. Well, actually, I could just say arg. It's an identity function, right? I think is what we call these. There we go. So we have that, and editable is really just doing what we're already doing by hand. Okay, great. So now let's figure out how we can edit these prompts and send it to retrigger to the component itself. Yeah, because I don't think there's anything wrong with having like component.inspector. So what we want to do here is let's have a editable component, and this is going to be a function that receives prompts. We're going to return our editable component. We're going to set the inspector on the editable component, and this thing is going to return basically React create element, the original component, and the props. So really this is just a pass-through at this point. So let me do const require, const react equals require react. So the one warning here is like, which react? codelifts or your apps. So we'll find out pretty soon, because I'll get some warnings from React about like, oh no, it's a different React instance, or I'm going to see something blow up because hooks are going to fail. Something's going to happen. So target container is not a DOM element. Wrap component. Yeah, so this is not a great sign, but actually, did you notice this? That I don't know who I'm talking to, but look at the title change. Title change to editable component. So let's say editable component.display name equals component.name or something. Nope. Let's see what this component actually has on it. Yeah, that? Okay, all right, well, let's try this. I wonder if I can even assign that. Thought that was like illegal. No idea. This is why I don't like this approach. Higher order components, we moved past them for a really good reason. Yeah, because what I needed to be able to do is just try to get the React reconciler to just render this stuff with new prompts. Question is where those new prompts are going to come from, and how can I trigger a re-render of a tree that's not even my own. So that's like really the trickiest part, because I could do the React thing of just like re-render the whole tree, because I have, two things. I have access to the root node. I know which DOM element is a root node, usually like, pound root or pound app. I have access to the React instance, so I could re-render this whole tree from scratch. The question is that will it honor the memoized props that I see in the the fiber instance? Because I have access to that too. I could mutate it. Sounds terrible, but I could mutate it and set the memoized props myself to whatever shows up in the inspector. And then whenever you cancel out, I can undo that. Likewise, if you were to re-render your app from some other effect anywhere in your application, like let's say if you changed routes or something, all those props are probably going to be like reset anyway from like another instance. I don't think it's pulling it directly from the DOM. I think it's just putting it there. But again, I don't quite know. So I could re-render, but for sufficiently complex component, you don't want to re-render the full app just so that way you can change what one child element is doing deep in the tree. You want to be able to target that one, say, please re-render this thing, which is why I wanted to be able to wrap it with like a higher order component. So let's say we figure out the naming, to do, which name. The other thing to consider is, I do have window.react set as part of register. So because I need to get access to your React and your React DOM instance, so that way I could reconstruct the context that your component lives within whenever I generate the inspector on the right. Whenever you register, you tell me who your React is and React DOM those instances are, and I put them on the window object just for right now. And that's a good way for me to just kind of get access to it whenever I need it. Because otherwise, codelift isn't part of your build tool or your pipeline or anything. So I don't actually have access to your React instance the same way that like you do as part of your create React app or Next.js config. So being able to get access to the compiled package itself off of like window is necessary for me to get access to the same like hooks, to the same context, to everything that your app actually is using to render within React. For me, I'm in my own render pipeline with my own instance in my own Next.js, so it doesn't quite work. But let's see if we have like window.react available for this thing. And actually, I'm going to do it right here, as close as to the create element as possible. And I want to know, let's see, editable, renders the editable component. Let's find out. Cool. So the very first time it renders, it actually has access to it. So let's do this. Let's get const react from the window object. So then that way, whenever we render this thing, we're always using your React. I wonder if this breaks on the server. Oh, it's a no-op. That's right. It's not going to break on the server because this is a client-only script. So if we were to hover over the editable component, shoot, still running into the same issue. So function editable component with props, React create element. Am I using the wrong signature for React? No, props, children, all that stuff seems right. I mean, I didn't think I need to actually like deconstruct anything. Target container is not a DOM element. This could be, hang on a second. It's having issues rendering. This is interesting. Target element is not a DOM. So wait, let's check out the inspector part. Because we have a couple of things going on here. We're rendering the preview. Let's just do like a render early. We'll return early on this thing. And let's return early on the inspector too. Let's just see how far we get into this. Hopefully TypeScript doesn't blow up. It's like, oh no, you're returning early, invalid code path, which is totally possible. I know, possibly undefined. Because some reason the return early is making it mad. Unreachable code. If I take this away, that's pretty funny, right? All right, okay, whatever. Let's just do this. No return earlies. We'll just comment out code like we used to do in the olden days. All right. So we have all these effects. Comment out, I'll delete. Whoop. Compiling. And of course this thing's on a blank screen, so I have to actually fully refresh. I just want to see that I can select it. That's all, because it's not going to do anything else otherwise. Okay. So now let's see if the break is happening when we're creating the inspector. Because it could be that the reference to the container on the right hand side is gone or incorrect, but I don't think that's the issue. Yeah, I do like that like the save is dependent on if he actually made changes. All right. So render preview is the culprit. So what we'll do is, let's see how far we can get. So yeah, the two things I'm doing here is I'm looking at where your node is, and I'm trying to race conditions. I'm looking at where your node is, and I'm trying to replace it, but React won't let me replace it with the new props, so I have to basically just render inside of it as if it's its own DOM tree, and React gets mad about that, and I get this warning. Render replacing React rendered children with a new root component, blah, blah, blah. So then what I do is I grab that new element and I replace what you had with it, which is this part, grabbing like, the first child, and it doesn't like that either. React is really mad whenever I do those things. So what I can do, and I'm not really quite sure why, because the node references should still be valid even if I have like a wrapped component here, but we'll find out why. And I can get this access to node to see what it is. The state node is the actual DOM node that should have access. Yeah, so target container is not a DOM element. Cool. So let's comment this stuff out. And let's look at a couple things. Let's see what node is. And let's go ahead and just get access to our selected instance. And these are all properties that exist. So selected is my React node. Instance is going to be, that double underscore React, fiber instance that we saw. And oh no, yeah, see, so node is null, which means that the way I'm getting, yeah, so element type is what we expected. And it returns a div, that's fine. So what is the problem that we're running into here? It returns a div. So anyway, the path I was going through is I was looking at like, what is the child? The child is going to be a div, and then there should be a, what was I looking for? State node. And it's null. And so I found in these situations, like state node is null whenever you have to like traverse like another layer down or something to get to it. So if I say div again, I can see like this is child h1, state node. Yeah, here it is, peachy black. So this is kind of peculiar because I mean, I don't know enough about like the inner workings of like fiber, but we have like this element type. Oh, I think that's the key. Well, no, then it renders a header. Yeah, and that's that element type. So I think my understanding of like how this stuff actually kind of worked might be like a little bit off. Is that we have like this type, and I was under the expectation is that if you find a type and then you were to go into a child, oh, you know what? That's what it is. This thing should actually be like a little bit more recursive to where I should be grabbing like the state node from whenever we click a component. I should be going down to like to the first, to basically like the first element type that's like not a component. So I think that's my mistake here because there's gonna be children underneath it. That's totally fine. But the problem is that I'm assuming that whenever I run into a component, that the very first, like, that it's going to have a direct JSX DOM node underneath it. Not that there's going to be like wrapping function upon wrapping function, because you could see how this editable component is within a div. So I just kind of got like lucky that that I happen to have like component div, and then component, some sort of HTML element. So I'm gonna make this like kind of call out here is that this needs to change to find first. I think I actually have some types for this. Let me see. Thinking about models, I may have created it. Yeah, I looked into like the fiber internals a bit and saw that I had some useful types because there's some numbers on here that tells me where is it, tag, I think tag equals 0 on some of these. So tag equals 0 tells me it's a function component. And then if I were to look at this child and I were to say, well, what is the tag for this one? This one's 0, so that means it's also a function component. So then if I were to click in one more, and then we can see the state knows this div, and then I see tag is 5. 5 tells me that it is a host component. Host component means that it's basically like a DOM host node. You have like a host text and a couple other things, but so far, like if I were to search for my code, like all right, look for a host component, you can see that we have like this reference here that's how we know that it's a. Sorry, I think I'm actually using like function component more than anything. Anyway, in my reconciliation, I look through and say, hey, if it's a function component, skip it. So I just need to make a note here that says find first host component state node as instance dot child can be a function, component, or other, yep, React fiber type that's not associated with the DOM. Cool. Yeah, so I have a couple notes here, but the thing that's kind of getting me is this editable component, the wrapping of like the functions, and as a reminder, all of this is so I could go back and have, editable, component with an inspector. You have the association. And then my editable component would have a way of just directly rendering what that component was. So that's basically like the crux of the issue, is that if with a wrapper component, much like how MobX or MobX state tree uses an observer around the component to observe changes and automatically render when those properties are updated or mutated. In the same way, having an editable component would allow me to automatically render the original component whenever the inspector changes the props. And I could find a way to make those two communicate. So whenever the inspector changes, I can tell this component, here's the, here is the context or the props associated with this specific inspector for this DOM node that we're editing. So there's a way around that. But before I even get there, it's throwing off like the name, the inspection, how the dev tools are returning. It kind of makes me think that this might be like the wrong approach. I also don't like the verbosity of it either, compared to like editable component on inspector equals something, or react.lazy, import inspector, which is what I would want the signature to look like for someone's code. Same thing. I think, what is it? Next.js uses dynamic, and you can tell it like SSO or false or something as well. So the code split options are there. I like that signature much more. I'll probably go ahead and like end the feed here and do some research. Like, I wonder if it's possible for me to do, to mess around like with a component like prototype somehow, and change like the assignment a little bit to be that function wrapper. But I don't know. I need to think of another way of doing this. Or, I mean, I could go back to the approach of like re-rendering the React root, the root of the app, and seeing if I can mutate what those props are available to it. Similarly, I know that the React dev tools allow editing props, so I could probably check out like the dev tools to see what that would allow, and talk to Brian Vaughn a little bit. He could probably help out like in this regard. So I'm gonna think on this like a little bit more, because the thing is, like, it seems possible to do this wrapping, but ultimately, is this the API I want? No. Is it leaking kind of details into the resulting app structure? Yeah, absolutely. Now, I think that's what kind of gets me, is that like I want to minimize the surface area and like kind of like the blast radius that's created from these sort of modifications. And the whole point of like codelift was being able to work with your existing React app with as little, just without like the jello effect of like poking it and making like your whole app like wiggle around. And I don't really like the idea of adding like properties and changing, honestly, from the perspective of a diff. The diff that we had for making something like editable, this is already kind of like enough to like bother me, let alone with the signature that I just had. That extra nesting that occurred just seemed way too much. I think I have like my white space telling it to like stay hidden, but yeah, it's just like too much nesting. It actually just doesn't look clear at all anymore. So this already tells me that like we're going like in the wrong direction. So I'm not gonna spend too much time on this. I'd rather get this feature kind of merged down and solve like some harder problems to avoid like the warnings, and yeah, focus on something that has like a little bit more like feature usefulness. So cool. Well, if you hung around for the feed, and this is actually pretty good, yeah, thanks for watching. Otherwise, I'm gonna go ahead and get pull request number 70 about wrapped up, and get this updated into the README with some documentation on how this can be like leveraged within like your own components. And then we're gonna move on to the next thing, probably with some state machines and upgrading to the latest Tailwind 1.2.0. All right, thanks.